I'm here today with Ed Westman from the External Relations team, who is our video producer. And I came across Ed just before Christmas, as he did a fantastic job on producing the Panto, which I know that a lot of you watched. In some later conversations, Ed shared with me that he had Asperger's, and I wanted him to come and do a recording just to share a little bit about that. So thank you, Ed. Can we start by talking about Asperger's? So what is it? What is Asperger's?
Asperger's syndrome, from my perspective, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. As far as I understand it, from my point of view, it's something that impacts one's ability to communicate and recognize communication in the world around them. This could be a difficulty in recognizing things like social cues, things that some people take for granted in terms of the way in which people communicate their emotions, the way in which I could communicate my emotions, the way that some people with Asperger's have difficulty in understanding communicative signals such as metaphors or idioms. Less so in terms of that in my case. You will find, as per the autistic spectrum, that no two people with Asperger's are necessarily the same. There is definitely a fluidity in terms of the types of experiences that one person can have with Asperger's. It can also result in a high attention to specific details. So this could be a particular interest. It can also affect you in terms of your sort of motor skills.
What are the you've talked there about some of the things that you can miss in terms of the social signals and how you sort of navigate space. What do you feel are the really positive aspects of Asperger's? What strengths does it give you?
I would say in my case, it's both a positive in terms of, I would say it gives you a sense of an alertness in my case. For example, I tend to be very, very aware of my surroundings, but the downside to that is sometimes when I try to sort of describe to someone what Asperger's is, usually I find myself boiling it down to one word, a kind of heightened sense of paranoia.
Okay.
So for example, I find it necessary when I go out to walk around with my headphones in and listen to music because I am very, very afraid that I'm going to walk past someone and they're going to say something unpleasant to me. Not
Okay.
because of my condition, just in principle, because, it wouldn't immediately appear to have anything that you could point to, but some people will find something. Or I tend to worry about things much more than others, which obviously can feed into anxiety, which I also suffer as well. People with Asperger's syndrome also tend to deal with things like depression and anxiety at certainly a much more considerable rate.
What strengths does it bring in terms of your work situation, Ed? Because what I noticed was you certainly had this incredible attention to detail when you were doing the Panto video and putting there things that I don't think anybody else would have thought of. So what makes you particularly good at what you do?
I mean, one thing with people with Asperger's is more typically they will have sort of one core interest. They kind of will force their kind of skills and their sort of perception around this one thing. So in
Yeah.
my case, it was always filmmaking.
Uh,
So in my case, I only really gained my skills only because I tried to learn from the best. So I would, and I became the best by, well, I became the best anyway. Well, I say I'm at least
you are
perceived.
the best. Yes.
I mean, I'm at least perceived as the best thank you, by my colleagues because ultimately you try to learn from the best people, whether it be for example Kurosawa, for example, as a filmmaker, etc., or you try to watch as much as you can, or you sort of dig into the research and the history of film. I mean, in my case, I remember one piece of advice my sister gave me was, I asked her, how do I ensure that I always have an imagination? And she said, graze, which basically means just take in as much information as you can. And certainly one learning curve for me with having Asperger's was trying to look at things outside of my comfort zone. I think another thing it certainly does give me is that I perhaps can, because of the fact that perhaps I'm not so, that I can be not quite as savvy to some social cues, it does give me a greater sort of ability to sort of step outside of what other people might other people might consider to be uncomfortable territory. So quite often with my sort of video projects, there's sometimes a sort of habit of I will sort of try and see if I could push something quite far creatively, and then my manager or my line manager in the past, it previously would have been Emma Cottle, who is my senior manager now, but now my line manager is Jen Ria. But quite often Emma Cottle would be the one to try to be kind of pull back the reins sometimes. And I think so in sort of that respect, the sort of strengths it's given me are essentially a high degree of concentration, but I would also say with that, it's also, there's a cautionary tale to it as well, in that there's a risk that you can perhaps focus too much on things. Like sometimes I'm quite prone to what someone might call tunnel vision, in that, I can spend a long time on something trying to get it right.
Because you want it to be perfect and you feel that you can improve it. Thank you, Ed. I can imagine doing this video is probably a little bit out of your comfort zone then, so I very much thank you for doing it. I want to ask you one last question, which I think would be really helpful. So what I'm interested to know is, in terms of working relationships, what advice could you give to somebody who has a colleague who has Asperger's, in terms of creating a really strong working relationship? What is helpful to you in terms of that working relationship?
In my case, I would say it boils down to, I would say, two sort of tenets. The first one would be honest, in that, in my experience, sometimes people have a tendency to try and blur uncomfortable truths, or
So
to,
soften things a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
quite often I would say it's better to be as blunt as possible. And because quite often that's kind of the way in which someone like me tends to respond to things, which sometimes can kind of, take people aback a little bit. But as I would say, the first thing is to be honest. The second thing is in respect to communicating to people with Asperger's, and also in how you carry yourself around people with Asperger's, which is to be an adult. I know that's perhaps sounds, well, it in itself is blunt, but it's really a case that I think there is sometimes a fear with people with Asperger's or on the autistic spectrum that the moment they would announce this, that they are being perhaps treated in a way like children, or there's a kind of,
Okay, I understand.
there's a sort of fear sometimes I would have where I would assume that if I announce this, then what's more likely than not is that there'll be a kind of, oh, they're there mentality, or a kind of cheek pinching, so to speak. And I think ultimately, you know, for however many sort of frustrations or anxieties there would be in terms of mine or other people with Asperger's ability to communicate with the outside world, there's obviously the greater fear of how is the world going to respond to me. And if they're sort of responding to me as if I need special treatment, then that becomes an issue. But at the same time, I do appreciate for someone in sort of an external position that it might be something of a challenge, because obviously, in being honest, I don't want people necessarily to tone police themselves, or in being honest and being an adult, I don't want people to kind of try and deform reality towards what they think I want. I mean, more often than not, you can just ask, but No, that's
I think
those are
I
my
think that advice is very clear. It's be straightforward and blunt. Don't soften things, or sometimes people go around the houses to say something, don't they? They say about 20 things before they get to the thing, and then treat you as an adult as opposed to being in any way patronising or undermining.
Yes, certainly.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ed. That's been incredibly helpful.
That's my pleasure, Justine. Thank you.